What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and today we are doing part 2 with my friend Matty, who you guys saw last week. If you guys didn't watch that episode, you can always watch it after this one, but if you want, stop here, go back to the last one, listen to it. Matty is a self-taught historian, and last week we covered really the 101 basics of cults and secret societies. Today we're going to go a little bit deeper into that, and we're going to talk about documented cases of satanic cults and how they bleed into each other. And Matty's going to build on last week. He's going to build on this week. And that's just a broad explanation of what we're going to talk about today, but we're going to dive into some pretty cool things. One of the things that I love about Matty, I met him on Twitter and he seems way beyond his age when you read his eloquent writing. And one of the really special things about him to me is he's only 23 and he's so well versed in so many things that many people haven't even began to scratch the surface of. And I just think he's incredible. And not only that, but if you listen to last week's episode, he's an incredible speaker too. You'd never guess this is his first time ever doing a podcast. And I'm super honored that he decided to do this series here with us today. So without further ado, Matty, thanks for being here again with me.
I'm so incredibly glad to be back on. I had so much fun doing the first episode. I had no idea how it was going to go, but it turned out better than I expected. So I guess I'm back for part 2. Last week we already talked about cult secret societies. We kind of spoke broadly about maybe some of the historical underpinnings on where they come from. This week, I wanted to kind of cast a wider and more modern net because, we touched on something like 5,000 years of history last week with a really, really broad pen. I felt like this week we could do a service to everyone to kind of cast away that last bit of doubt about satanic cults in a way that we can understand. So I'm going to be touching on a few cases. Basically, I'm going to touch on what I already talked about last week broadly, which was Henry Lee Lucas and the Hand of Death, David Berkowitz and the Son of Sam murders, and the intermediary, more or less, between those two, which is the Process Church of the Final Judgment. So I'm going to be just letting you guys know ahead of time. I'm going to be quoting directly a lot because I have a couple books here with me. Basically, there's some really extreme journalism that was done to document these cases by a couple of incredible journalists, and I guess out of homage to them, and also because I just can't put it as good as they do, I'm going to be reading a lot of their quotes from Henry Lee Lucas, quotes from David Berkowitz, and that'll do more than even I can do to explain just how deep these stories run. Is there anything you want me to talk about before I get going, or how do you want to do this?
Maybe if whether you want to do it all at once right before or as you go, if you could explain, just I'm sure you're going to, who those people are that you mentioned for people who might not have ever heard of them. But otherwise, yeah, take it away.
Yeah. Okay. So I think what I'll do is I'll describe each one individually, just so it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. I'll start with Henry Lee Lucas. So Henry Lee Lucas was a serial killer who killed all across the country in the United States. He confessed to killing at least 600 people. And there was quite a bit of controversy surrounding his case. He was sentenced to death, I believe, in the 1980s. That sentence was eventually commuted by the governor of Texas, George W. Bush. Henry Lee Lucas had a partner named Otis Toole, who at least confessed that he was part of a family satanic cult on a ranch in Texas. The two of them ended up being part of what he referred to as a satanic cult called the Hand of Death, which took place out in the Everglades in Florida. That's where they had their training camp anyway. They were involved in child trafficking, murders for hire, crimes as innocuous as car theft, and like gas station robbery, but they were primarily involved in things like murder, child pornography, and child trafficking. So I can just go ahead and kind of give you another. Henry, he had a really rough childhood. His father was in a wheelchair. His mother was a prostitute who abused him. He had a horrible childhood and upbringing, and that bled into his life. He met up with Otis Toole at a bar, and they went around the country committing murders. So one day when they were out committing murders, I'm just going to go ahead and start quoting from the book directly here. Otis Toole and Henry were stopped by this car, and a businessman basically offers them a job, not trafficking, but basically driving stolen cars into Mexico, which is obviously comparatively innocuous. But Henry Lee Lucas, who was already a felon at the time for the murder of his mother, said, "It seems really dumb, for me to be moving these stolen cars because I'm already a felon. If I get caught, I'm right here. The crime scene is right here. I'm sitting in it." Nonetheless, the guy introduced himself. He said his name was Don Meaderick, and basically said, after Henry Lee Lucas told him, "I'm not going to steal these cars," he said, "Well, that's okay. You could go ahead and commit murder for me down in Florida. It'll pay $5,000 to $10,000 per. The only thing is," and this is a direct quote, he says, "You'll have to join the Hand of Death," Meaderick murmured. "It's a religious organization. You'll have to attend our training camp and learn to worship the devil. Once you join us, you can never back out. But if you're serious about joining the Hand, come to me in Miami and I'll help you open the glorious gates of hell." Which is obviously very strange. Henry Lee Lucas says to him, "How did you find me then? Like you planned on finding me, I suppose?" And he says, "Henry, we didn't meet by accident. I belong to a big organization. We've had our eyes on you since you left prison in Michigan. We know about the 5 women you killed after your release, and we know what you and your partner have been doing for the last 5 years." So obviously it's pretty crazy. This wasn't a serendipitous meeting that the two had met on the road. It turned out that Otis Toole, his partner, who I already said in passing was a member of a death cult, knew Don Meaderick and was already a part of the Hand of Death. So it's not a stretch to say that both Don Meaderick and Otis Toole worked to bring Henry Lee Lucas into this cult. So inevitably, he wants to be a part of this organization. He's told, "You can have anything you want, all the money you want, all the women you want. We're glorifying Satan and you'll get all the glory on earth you want." So they head out into the Everglades to this camp in the middle of nowhere. And I mean, at the cult, he describes it. It's really crazy, actually, because this whole book, Hand of Death by Max Call, is basically just a tape recording of a conversation that Henry Lee Lucas had with Max Call. And he describes pretty much in vivid detail what happens in the camp. So I'll just give you a direct quote. "Henry witnessed his first devil worshiping ceremony that night. In the light of the full moon, he watched the naked body of his victim carried into the sacred circle on the shoulders of 8 robed women. He and Otis watched from the outside the circle as the hand cut out the man's heart and dedicated his death to Satan." So obviously unbelievable, a really just crazy thing to stumble upon already in the Everglades when you're a part of a satanic cult. I'll give you one more quote real quick. So one of the rules, because like I said, they committed murder for hire in this cult. One of their most important rules was never leave a living witness to testify against you. So inevitably, single murders turned into double murders and triple murders, and that might give you an idea how somebody like Henry Lee Lucas can admit to committing 600 plus murders over a string of years.
Now, does it say anywhere like how they picked their victims? Was there a strategy, or was this just purely random from what you understand?
It was purely random unless they were taking contracts for hire. And so the single point of this, and Don Meaderick, as well as Henry Lee Lucas, makes this clear, was that it was worship of the devil. It wasn't. It was evil first, and it was organization second. So the money, obviously, taking murder contracts for hire was an important detail, but more than anything, it was just for the sake of evil. And also, it's worth noting that members of the cult themselves were killed if they, say, failed at committing some sort of crime. if they showed a lack of willpower, maybe something was a little bit too dark for them. So I would like to note that a lot of the reasons that cults like these are able to kind of operate in plain sight is because the people that are witness to the crimes, the people who are committing the crimes, are often killed before they themselves can testify. Similar to how the mafia might kill someone that they suspect is an informant. So when they say never leave a living witness, that ultimately means someone who's committing the crime as well. So part of the testimony that Henry Lee Lucas also leaves is that they were involved in child trafficking. They had the hand of death, that is, had a ranch in Mexico that they took children to. They had them participate in snuff films, child pornography, etc. So Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole take a job taking these children in these stolen cars to this ranch in Mexico. I can go ahead and give you another direct quote. The longer the people have to wait for their kids, the more they'll pay. I've got a special order for 2 young girls, he smiled, and you better make them cuties. Why? Henry asked. They're going to become movie stars, he reported with a laugh. It'll be their first and last picture, but the producer wants to project the complete Beauty and the Beast story. It's a snuff movie. Right on, the man exclaimed, so make them real beauties. How old? Henry questioned. Make them between 11 and 14. How soon? Otis pressed. I could use them right now, but I'll give you a couple weeks. Just make sure they're right for the parts. They'll be drugged, Otis said. Hell, that's okay. They won't live long enough for their habits to become expensive. So again, obviously,
Dark.
really, really, really dark. I'm not going to stay too long on this story because obviously when you're dealing with just a direct audio tape, you know, there's not a lot of research priced into that. But I think this one quote in the book can be summed up and can kind of allow me to segue into the other stories. Basically, when dealing with a lot of these jobs, Henry and Otis were curious to know, you know, what their parameters were, what the breadth of their work might be, and particularly in one case, how many children they might need to be involved in the kidnapping of. So their leader laughed and said, "We have chapters in almost every state, and they all need live bodies for sacrifice." So yeah, the notion of a nationwide network of satanic cults has a little bit more legs than people would like to admit. I think that really allows me to kind of segue into my next story, which we're going to talk about a cult called the Process Church of the Final Judgment. So the Process Church of the Final Judgment was a cult that was started in England in the 1960s. It was started by Robert and Marianne de Grimston, who were students of L. Ron Hubbard, his Church of Scientology. They studied at L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology University in England. They basically decided that it wasn't extreme enough for them. That's at least like what common historical consensus on the topic says. They took a lot of Scientology's kind of more minor doctrines, like of auditing and Dianetics and things like that, and brought it with them into their own church. But it was actually primarily centered around apocalypse theology. So in a nutshell, what they believed is that Jesus and Lucifer, Satan, were unified through what they described as love. They basically said that good and evil are more or less the same thing, which is going back to episode 1, a Gnostic creed. And it was that exact belief was more or less espoused by a group called the Cathars. But long story short, Robert de Grimston wrote a lot of books called like Jesus on War and these sorts of things. And he wrote one of the most particular quote that will live as long as discussion of the process lives is where he says, "This is the ultimate command, thou shalt kill." And so the process was all about creating anarchy, basically to bring about a world war, which is really funny because it's the exact plan of Charles Manson's Helter Skelter. And the reason that that's common is because Charles Manson and the process were in the same place at the same time, believing the same thing. So the process eventually left England and came to Haight-Ashbury and Los Angeles in 1968, and were living right next door to Charles Manson. That's documented in Ed Sanders' The Family. Charles Manson was a really, really big fan of Robert the Grimston, and the Manson family were huge believers of the process. Charles Manson wrote an article in the Process's magazine on the issue on death. And so it's very likely that the whole helter-skelter plan to start a war prompted by the Sharon Tate murders and the La Bianca murders was actually influenced by the process. I don't want to get off too much on a tangent, but everything that you attribute or that anybody attributes to Charles Manson, it was not his own theology. That was his interpretation of the process to give you an idea of how heinous their beliefs were. So yeah, I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but the process was a very prolific church. There's very significant reason to believe they were involved in the murder of Robert F. Kennedy. And so it's well documented that as soon as Robert F. Kennedy was murdered, the process, which was a really prolific and public church, completely went underground. It's believed that they splintered into a few different organizations, and documentation from there gets really, really sparse and far between because there's tons of anecdotal reports of murders of people wearing black capes, which is what they were known to wear, sacrifice German shepherds, which is what they were known to do.
Why
all
German
across,
shepherds? Do you know?
the answer of why specifically German shepherds, I have no idea. Why dogs? Because they're easy to get their hands on. I think it's just more of an animal sacrifice thing. And they wore black, and they kind of had this really unified, dark, edgy aesthetic. They were also very fascinated with Nazism. So if you wanted my personal best guess, it's just that they really liked the aesthetics of Germany and kind of classic German things. But what's known is they splintered into these groups called like the Chingons and 4-Pi. These are two really, really murderous cults, and that's kind of where the story gets murky. But what is known is that they were involved all over the country. They had networks all over the country. And that brings us to David Berkowitz. So
Before you go into his story, can you let viewers know what was hypothesized of what actually happened to Robert F. Kennedy versus what the public narrative was?
oh yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
You're good.
So,
I think that's fascinating. There's so much mystery around these presidential families, especially the Kennedys.
yeah. So Robert F. Kennedy was, the common story with Robert F. Kennedy was that he was murdered by a lone actor named Ciron. And basically that Ciron was just kind of a lone nut who really wanted to kill the president for unknown specific reasons. He shot him, and that was that. And I think it's worth noting that I can't think of the exact name, but it's one of the living Kennedys today, met with Ciron. He's still in prison in San Diego County, and has said, I'm certain Ciron did not kill Robert F. Kennedy. I've talked to him. That is a fact. So that's what's the common belief is. Let's talk real quick about some of the holes in that story. Ciron was a member of the Process Church of the Final Judgment. He was fascinated with the occult. In his notebooks, he would write about occult stories, and he showed very clear signs of being, for lack of a better term, hypnotized. So if you ever read his journals, he shows signs of this technique called automatic writing, which is basically you're put under hypnosis and you're kind of guided to let your subconscious brain dictate its thoughts, which if they've been manipulated by hypnosis, will show clear signs of tampering. And so in his notebooks, he'll discuss things like murder for hire. He'll say things like pay to the order of, pay to the order of. Like he talked about how all he needed to do was take one shot and then he'd be able to buy himself a Mustang. And so there's a lot of really kind of odd details. There's also many people saw testimony that he was with a girl named Peggy Osterkamp, who was like a second actor right before he committed the scene of the crime, or committed the crime at the scene of the crime, I should say. But that was basically covered up by the police. Robert F. Kennedy also was really close with Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski, who were murdered by the Manson family, obviously. And the night before Sharon Tate was murdered, she had dinner with Robert F. Kennedy, which is, you know, obviously, I guess you would say coincidental that two people who were murdered by, or at least connected to, associates of the Process Church or the Final Judgment were having dinner together the night before one of them was murdered. Also, members of the Process Church were at parties with Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate was initiated into a satanic cult in the 1960s. So there's a lot of, I guess you would say, funny business. But if I were to give my...
There's belief too that Charles Manson was a CIA agent.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard a lot about this theory. I can't say that I've delved enough into it to give my personal opinion.
Yeah.
But I think it's just kind of a rule of thumb when you're dealing with the 1960s and early 70s, where there's smoke, there's almost always fire. So yeah, I don't find it anything but very odd that actual political business, for lack of a better term, would have political motives rather than no motive. I don't know if there's any more that you want to touch on there, but that's kind of the story as I see it.
Yeah. And so Robert Kennedy and the Kennedys, do you believe that they were also part of the cult, or do you think that the motive was more because they were outsiders?
Yeah, I don't think the Kennedys were involved with the process that I know of, right? I'm shooting from the hip here.
Sure.
What I do think is that the murder of Robert F. Kennedy was part of a plan to create chaos, for the sake of chaos and in hopes of creating a power vacuum, for lack of a better term, that the cult might set into. That's and I'm pulling from a lot of Charles Manson's plans as he told it to the Manson family, that once the Great War took over and everybody died, they would rise up and rule. So that would be my personal belief. What is the government's role in that? What is the CIA's potential role in that? Your guess is as good as mine, but the Kennedys were obviously great political enemies, one way or another. So I don't know. I don't want to theorize too much before I step into kind of foolish territory.
Of course. There's definitely a lot going on though, with how many assassinations and random deaths around that family and then the people that were involved with them.
And I would even, to add another layer to that, is kind of the crazy milieu of the 1960s in but predominantly Southern California, where you have hundreds, if not more, cults of satanic influence connected to Hollywood connected to the government, and the government connected to cults, all operating at the same time, all with lots of money, and lots of other strange things, all kind of coexisting at once. There's actually a really excellent book that I would recommend to anybody who's interested about this kind of thing, called Laurel Canyon by David McGowan. He talks about all of this, at least in some fashion or another, about how the hippie movement and its connection to the occult, and the occult's ultimate connection to government agencies. So I would recommend everybody read that. It's truly one of the most interesting books I've ever read.
The hippie movement tied to cults. That's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, so Charles Manson was a really good friend to a lot of popular names who have only as of late been able to distance themselves from him. But like Dennis Wilson, who's a member of the Beach Boys, had the whole Manson family live at his house for like an entire summer. I mean, he let Charles Manson drive his car. He gave him money. A lot of names, and these will probably have more significance to people much older than me. But like Mama Cass, a member of the Mamas and the Papas, was great friends with Charles Manson. She was actually an early suspect in the Sharon Tate murders. People like Crosby, Stills, and Nash, they were linked to the occult. I mean, I could kind of go on and on here, but the whole hippie movement is both inseparable from the occult and the government influence. I can give you a couple quick examples. So like Jim Morrison of The Doors, his dad was a member of military intelligence, and he was involved in, I think it was the early United States nuclear program. I might be wrong on this. Most of the members of the Mamas and the Papas, their parents were all involved in military intelligence as well. And interestingly enough, as far as like history shows, none of them really even were early musicians. Like they all just kind of moved to Laurel Canyon in the same year, about 1964, and they all just decided for no reason that they were going to make music. I mean, I think it was members of the Byrds. Again, like that's what David McGowan's Laurel Canyon will tell you. It details all these different bands, but I want to say members of the Byrds didn't even own instruments when they came together, and their manager just like bought them for them. They had a manager before they had instruments, and the manager bought them instruments and then kind of like taught them how to play. So long story short, there's no coincidence that allows for all of these musicians with military intelligence ties to come together out of nowhere and then become the hit makers of an entire generation. Especially when all of them are buddy with Charles Manson in the process, etc. So sorry for the long-winded tangent, but it is a topic that's very obliquely related.
And people, no matter what age, I think the hippie movement is something most people are aware of, whether they lived it, whether their grandparents did, or whether they've learned about it, especially with how cannabis is becoming legal. I think people are understanding more of the prohibition time too, which was then, and being able to tie that together, that's really fascinating, because I think people equate that more with, oh, the hippie movement was this peace, love, and joy type thing, and it was a very positive movement, but we know right now, even when you look at movements that are propagated mainstream and that grow really big, that there's typically always an agenda behind it if it's given attention and if it grows, and back then there really probably wasn't much knowledge or ways to learn the agenda behind something. But we know now that things that get really big, there's usually a reason why something grows in the mainstream view, and things that aren't meant to stay really small, so it's really fascinating to learn maybe the truth behind why that movement grew so big and why so many people got sucked into it, almost like a cult,
Yeah. I mean, I think when you're talking about the 60s and 70s, especially, you're talking about like the golden era of movements that were kind of, for lack of a better term, astroturfed for a larger goal. And I think that would be the prime example of that would be like the LSD movement as a whole. Obviously integral to LSD in the 1960s is the discussion of Operation MK Ultra. And kind of, I guess you would say the alumnus of MK Ultra, like Ted Kaczynski, Charles Manson, probably seron. I mean, I almost am like stumbling for lack of words to think about A, how broad that program was, and B, all the people that came out of it that just so happened to play a very integral role and a really coincidental role in, for lack of a better term, helping the government with its own aims. There's a really, really good book that, again, this is like one of the most foundational books for people who want to talk about the history of the 1960s. It's called Mind Control by Walter Boart. And he'll discuss the whole history of both hypnosis as a governmental tool of mind control, as well as MK Ultra. And he discusses how it's implausible that Seron was just a lone actor in the murder of Robert F. Kennedy. He discusses how James Earl Ray was not the lone actor in the murder of Martin Luther King. I'm trying to think if there's any others that are specific. I don't know off the top of my head, but everybody should read that book. It will change your mind about an entire 2 to 3 decades, and it'll give you a really good link to what government intervention in a movement really looks like. And I mean, I can talk for hours about the 60s and 70s and the government's role in it, because between serial killers, the Vietnam War, the hippie movement, and intelligence agencies, you have maybe the last really obvious age of the government interfering in public events before it kind of becomes more covert. And I mean, we could do a whole episode on that easily, probably a whole series, but I would suggest everybody dive in and read Laurel Canyon and Mind Control.
I'll put those in the show notes too for people.
Sure.
I think that's important too. So much time has gone by since the 60s and 70s, you know, and information that was well documented then and that was factual, like MK Ultra, that's something that's now considered a conspiracy theory, when if people would just go do a little research, they'd see that that was an actual program through the government and CIA. You know, so how that gets misconstrued through generations is fascinating, how they're able to almost just change history, and how people really believe that just because they say, hey, we stopped practicing something, or this isn't happening anymore, you know, people just think that, oh, the government stopped doing it and doesn't exist anymore. There's no more of those experimentations going on and we're good. But it's like you said, this was publicly, people were initiating these programs in a very public way. And so there's just been a shift in how they do it. You know, there's more information now. If they were to conduct these experiments publicly, like how they did with the LSD, you know, that would really be infiltrated fast with people understanding the real motive behind that. Where back then, people just thought it's this cool new drug and it's just this cool hippie movement, you know, and there was probably very little of people that were publicly saying, no, wait, there's something bigger going on here. It was probably such a small group of people, if even any, that were able to really have their voices heard back then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I will note real quick, people who do know like about MK Ultra, I suppose, tend to fall into like this one camp where they kind of think it's like, oh, just somewhere in like Langley, Virginia, there's like, you know, 100 people in the CIA building that are strapped to a chair being force-fed LSD, and like that's the full extent of the program. And I mean, that likely did happen, right? But MK Ultra, you know, was being perpetrated on universities. It was being perpetrated in prisons. It was being perpetrated in hospitals, in mental institutions, by private companies who were contracted out by intelligence agencies. We're talking about thousands and thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who were force-fed LSD without knowing it. I mean, there was health clinics in the Haight-Ashbury that were, you know, like free health clinics for people who had medical issues during the hippie movement, who were just given LSD and tested on for no reason. There was brothels where intelligence agents masquerading as prostitutes would give LSD to people. Like this program is so much broader than just like a single agent. We're talking about all across the country. People were being treated like lab animals. And of course it's well documented, but it brings to the question always, well, what isn't documented? How bad did it get? And I mean, like, it wasn't just LSD either. I should note that LSD was actually, I guess you would say, like the conclusion of MK Ultra. They started because, I mean, the original program was started under a guy named George Estabrooks during World War II, like 1943 or so. And it started out that they just wanted to learn to hypnotize people to try and get secrets during the war out of them. And they found that this hypnosis could be enhanced if given drugs, different things, some like different saline solutions and kind of strange thing. It was a trial and error project ultimately. But by the time the 60s came around, they found that LSD was actually like a really, really potent way to start melding people's minds when used with hypnosis. And that's important to note, is it's with hypnosis. But throughout that trial and error project, some of the drugs that these people were given were unbelievable. Like, I mean, I'm trying in Mind Control by Walter Boart, he details the name of this one drug, and I can't remember the name. It's something like J6 or something strange like that. It's an alphanumeric name, but it simulated the effects of drowning, more or less. Like, it was such a high grade sedative that people's like psychosomatic systems would fail, and they would just not be able to breathe because they'd be so sedated. And so in a lot of cases, what started out as a plan to extract truth from people, it really just kind of became torture. And so obviously when that's perpetuated on a very wide scale, you're going to have some people who are very, not just profoundly affected, but their minds are shattered. And so I suppose the really fair way of looking at that might be to say, well, no wonder there was so many people who became killers who were involved with MK Ultra. I don't know if that's the full story, right? But perhaps starting with people who are so destroyed makes a really good candidate to then start paying for someone to undertake murder. I don't know.
Especially if they're under mind control and have been, programmed for a specific amount of time. And as we know now, MK Ultra is a big part of these cult systems. Mind control is a huge part of cult systems. So it's just fascinating how, like I said, and how you said, it was an experiment that might have started really small, grew really big, perpetuated on the public, and then infiltrated now into just specific places and governing spaces in the world, whether that is the government, military, and these cult systems, just to name a few. But how covert it is now, but still how prevalent, there's, you're naming 3 cults today that you're discussing, and I'll let you talk about that a little bit more. But these are all over the world, these systems, and this mind control is one of the biggest parts of that, to create that loyalty to these systems, and MK Ultra and mind control is far from being over. If anything, like, it's gotten such a huge boost almost the last few decades with all the technology now that they're able to use, versus a lot of the old school methods that they had to go through. Drugs are still obviously prevalent with it, but there's so many more ways now. Mind control is so refined that whenever it's perpetuated onto the public has no idea at all that there's even anything wrong, where at least when there's LSD involved and people are taking that, there's other people on the outside saying, geez, there's all these drugs going around. There's obviously something different shifting in society, where now it's very silent how mind control is perpetuated onto people and proliferated in the world.
Absolutely. And you've given me a couple of things I feel like I should note there.
Yeah.
So like I noted, the first kind of thing involved in the MK Ultra program was hypnosis. One of the outcomes that they found when doing these experiments was that just with hypnosis alone, they could get people to murder on command. And I don't want to spoil the whole book, but that discovery, obviously, that murders could be committed on command, and that amnesia could be put within the people who committed the murder, that they could not even remember it after the fact, certainly creates a very dangerous weapon that would be used very effectively in political assassinations, such as James Earl Ray and Martin Luther King, or Ciron and Robert F. Kennedy. The second thing, I think that you said that mind control is more advanced. Michael Aquino, who we talked about last episode, he wrote a series of books called Mind War, Mind Star, and Find Far, which were they kind of are rambling books, but they kind of detail a lot of his strategies that he was engaged in as the member in charge of psychological operations in the Army. And he discusses one tool that can be used in mind control that no doubt he used when engaging in the things that he was engaged in, was the changing of electromagnetic frequencies, having a device that could change or emit electromagnetic frequencies that would alter a person's brain, making them more suggestive. He talks about various other things, but he discusses that you could keep this device on you, just like on your person, and you could use it on someone without them even knowing. And so obviously, being that he was involved in psychological operations in the Army in the 1980s, I think it was the 60s and 70s, maybe not the 80s, but that tool was being used. And if he's willing to disseminate it to the public, there's obviously more that is going on. No doubt mind control is being perpetuated on the public in some fashion, whether it's behind closed doors or in public, or who knows, I have no idea. But it's simply too valuable of a tool to abandon. The applications of it are eternal. So yeah.
Especially, it's like you look at what was accomplished in the 60s and 70s with these programs in the CIA documents that were released to the public before they kind of pulled that and have started scrubbing it off the internet. But this was extremely effective even back then. And this was a long time ago. Think about how many years have gone by and how much more time they've had, more technology. Advancements these days are so much faster than advancements were in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Now it's like 20 years worth of advancements comparatively back then are now, so it's just fascinating how people believe that something so effective, like you said, this was something that they knew worked and was very powerful, that they would just stop doing, even though it worked so well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's kind of the motto of I guess you would say United States government classified disclosures. Is like, well, of course we did that back then, but we learned, and nothing happened. Nobody was punished for it, but we just decided that it was a bad idea. And we definitely wouldn't use it on other people either, like other countries. That would certainly be unfair.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so for the two cults that you already talked about, was there any, I don't even know the right word for it. Were they identified to the point where they were infiltrated was there anything done after they found out that these cults existed? Or did this happen many years later where this information was released to the public and these cults were identified publicly, and as well as these kind of cult leaders?
No. Okay. Well, let me explain.
Yeah.
The Hand of Death book regarding Henry Lee Lucas was basically just discounted wholesale, despite the fact that Henry Lee Lucas's involvement with the Hand of Death cult was proven in a book called Painted Black by Carl Raschke, which talks about satanic cults all across the board. And there was like Texas Rangers who were involved in prosecuting his case, who were like, yes, we have proven that he was involved in these cults. Here's these maps where he planned to take out murders. But they just basically said, it seems like he's lying and we can't prove it. And that was that. In regards to the process, it's frustrating, but it's like, you can't just because they said, oh, you should commit murder, I guess you can't prove that they did anything. And they went underground as soon as Robert F. Kennedy was murdered. So it's like, well, we don't even know where they went. They went all across the country. There was different cases where people would be caught and caught doing murders, and saying, yes, I am a part of this group. But they would either recant their statements or they would be discredited. One that comes to mind is a guy named Stanley Dean Baker, who committed a murder of a man in San Francisco near the Presidio Air Base, which is also the same air base where Michael Aquino's cult operated later in the 1990s. He and a group of other people killed a man. They painted the wall with his blood and wrote "Satan Saves" and "Zodiac," which is interesting. And Stanley Dean Baker was caught for this murder, and he said, I have a problem. I am a cannibal. And to prove it, he showed a man's severed finger bone. And then he admitted to eating a man's heart, a living beating heart in the Santa Monica Mountains, or I think it was the Santa Cruz Mountains, actually. He admitted to being a part of a Los Angeles cult where they all did these things, where they would sacrifice men, where they would cremate them, where they would drink the blood of German shepherds, all stuff that the process was known to do. And then later, when he actually went to trial, he said, I was just lying. Despite the fact that he showed a man's finger bone, that he was caught for these murders where multiple people were involved, where proof of being in a satanic cult was there. He just said, I was lying, and they basically took it at face value because, as usual, the public doesn't want to believe, or they can't believe. He was given 14 years and was let out in I think it was 1986 or 87. And as far as we know, is just out on the streets, despite the fact that he was involved with a satanic cult that likely was involved in the Zodiac killings as well, because he was committed a murder like 6-7 years after the original Zodiac killings in the same area, said Zodiac. And like, there's just no connection to that. That's just simply implausible. And so the Zodiac killings, I can just touch on those real quick.
Yeah.
They were all in the San Francisco area in the 1967, 1968. You had a lot of really sporadic murders that they never matched. So like, normally people might think when you have a serial killing, it would match, like the MO would be very similar, but it wasn't. Like for in one case, a guy, like the Zodiac killer, wrote notes to the police taunting them, coming up with these kind of mathematic ciphers that couldn't be solved, and so he would just be committing these murders. But it would always be different situations, and there would be different descriptions of what he looked like. Obviously, that didn't match because it was other people. One time, he showed up in a costume with the Zodiac killer symbol just on it, and decided like stab somebody instead of shooting them. The Zodiac killer one time requested to speak to a member of the CIA, not a police chief. But the funniest thing of all was that people like couldn't solve these ciphers that he was writing, but somebody like cracked the code specifically that, well, I guess you couldn't say cracked it for certain because you'd have to have confirmation, but it pointed to the geographic location of a mountain in California called Diablo Mountain, which obviously, when you're coming from a satanic cult point of view, is something that's not nothing. And the measurement, because these were all mathematic, that they used to find these coordinates was a measurement known as radian, which operates using like a measurement of pi, right? The mathematical number pi, which when you're dealing with a cult in the same area known as 4 pi is not nothing. So the reason that the Zodiac killings have not been decisively solved, I guess you would say, is because multiple people were involved, just in the same way the Son of Sam killings, multiple people were involved. And I think that there's other cases across the world where there's one serial killer who just can't be found. There's always some reason he eludes capture. Another one that comes to mind is a guy called the Monster of Florence, which was again proven to be a cult. When you can't find who the precise one serial killer is and he seems to be taunting you, it's because it's a cult involved. And when multiple people are involved, it makes it a lot harder to find one murderer. The Son of Sam is like the best case study on that in the world, and the work that Maury Terry did in journalism is truly probably the greatest like piece of journalism of our time. But it's hard to find just one satanic cult series of murderers to talk about. So I went a lot of directions there, but
that's a lot of pieces. That's a lot of pieces though to this puzzle, you know,
yeah.
And so many of these cases have happened so long ago that they're probably not familiar to people now unless they've done research.
Mm-hmm.
But it is fascinating. You even see it, you know, the Ghislaine Maxwell case now, how they're able to twist that publicly. So people just go on with their lives and don't ask questions just because there's a veil narrative that we're told. And you have to wonder, without ways of finding the actual story, we have so many different ways. It's hard to sift through information, but we have so many more avenues to find it. Back then, they mostly just had their TV or a radio or hearsay on what happened, you know, so they could have fed the public any story and the public just goes along with it, which is really interesting because now knowing what we know and what we've seen just in these last few years, it's like how many things historically, how many serial killers and people that went missing after committing all these murders and just were never found. Like what is the true backstory on so many of these things that we were told this veil story?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, like kind of I guess maybe it's a bit of cliche, but it will always apply, is the notion of, well, if the news is fake, then what about the history? Yeah. And I mean, obviously, I don't mean to draw on an even more extreme cliche, but like we see all the time, news is very clearly misreported on things that are happening right around us in the world. And once you see it, once you actually see what it's like, you can't unsee it. So then what about something that gets forgotten about, or something that where the only people who knew about it got killed, or something that's too incredible to believe that happened 50 years ago? The idea that we have any true notion about events from a long time ago just off of what we're told without examining it is just impossible.
100%. And that's why I love even just learning from the last episode, you know, the history of all this, because that is almost impossible to find. It's been amazing learning about all the research that you've been able to compile and the books that really aren't even in print that you've been able to get your hands on, and just learning who some of these key players were in either initiating the agendas, whether they were the antagonists, and then also the Bill Coopers of the day who were the protagonists, almost fighting against that and pushing back against the narrative. But so much of that is so few and far between, and unless you actually know those names, you're not really going to hear about these stories anymore, especially the protagonists, the ones that were coming forth and speaking truth about all this. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. And it's really funny too, because like, I mean, I kind of touched on this briefly last episode, but I think it's worth noting again, because it's the anchor of this whole thing that you and I are involved in. And it's just like saying that satanic cults and their actions is not real. It's just simply not real. Is like saying, for example, something like Egypt is not real. You're talking about thousands of years of history, thousands of events across the world, documentation, people, symbols. Like you're not discounting that David Berkowitz may or may not have been involved in a thing, because he's just a drop in the pan. And so it does obviously take, you have to immerse yourself. You have to immerse yourself in the events to find it. But 5,000 years of history is, you can discount one. You can't discount all of it. You just simply cannot spend all your time debunking every single one of these. And I don't even just mean because it's time intensive. I'm just saying that no single person is coming up with all these lies, and no single person, no single line of people for 5,000 years has been writing all these events and getting killed for it for the sake of fun. Like you, as soon as you spend a little bit of time seeing all these different events, you realize they can't all be coincidental.
Especially, I mean, on my show featuring survivors primarily and talking about child abuse, I always mention in these episodes, so many of the events that these survivors are coming forth and talking about are exactly the same as strangers all over the world who they've never met before.
Right.
Right? But they're all still being discredited and they're all still being delegitimized. And that's always the catch, right? It's like how you've mentioned with patterns, like at what point do you have to face that and say, what are the odds that all of these dozens and dozens, probably thousands, millions maybe, of people have had the same exact experience in a different part of the world and have no idea who each other are?
Yeah.
At what point does somebody have to look at that and say, is there a little bit more to this than I'm allowing myself to, configure in my mind?
Yeah. And I mean, it's like, I think the first step, or I guess like one of the most major steps in this process, is just the willing acceptance that people really are evil. Because I think it's because we live in a world where we don't ever have to really face it, and this is where the difference between people who survive these things and people who don't, it's a certain kind of knowledge you just can't extract. But when you start with this childish notion of like, yeah, there's bad people in the world, but they can't be that bad, or like that just seems too unbelievable. These kind of examples of real evil happening over and over and over and over again, they really chip away at your sense of what you really calibrate evil to be. But once you can look in the face the reality that there's people in the world who are really that vile, who have to pretend that they're not, who have to function in the light for their efforts in the dark to continue, then you can realize that, oh, there's a certain percentage of people in the world who their very existence in public as normal people is a lie that is perpetuated against the public on a daily basis, year in and year out, because if it wasn't, then they wouldn't be able to get away with what they're doing. And that requires a ton of courage to accept, because when you accept that notion, you accept that I am saying that there are evil people all around me, and I don't exactly know what they look like, but I do see the signs, and maybe I'm one of the few people who does, and I have to try and convince everyone else that I know, and they don't. It's I don't have to explain to the people who get it, but
Yeah.
it's unbelievable, and a process that we'll be fighting for years.
I agree. And I think too, for people, the depth of intelligence almost and strategy that goes behind these covert operations is also, I think, so hard for people to wrap their minds around. I mean, in the first two stories that you told, I'll let you go into the third one after this, but the first two cults that you were talking about, they had connections and they were totally separate stories, and you see Charles Manson kind of hopping from story to story and being involved with different things, right? But when we look at these instances separately, they're provided to us as the story of what is involving the people that are caught or who are perpetuated. But when you start linking these stories, that's when it gets really mind-boggling, just realizing the intention that has gone behind these murders and these scandals and how much time went into planning all of this. Whether or not the victims were random or not, that's not really, it doesn't really matter. But to think people got away with murdering 600 people and nobody even batted an eye until many years later when this literature came out that, sat on the shelves probably forever until people like you come along and are like, what is this? But books like that aren't bestsellers. Those aren't things that the majority of people have ever really read or have exposed themselves to. So that part's interesting too, just realizing how connected a lot of these stories are and how there's certain players that seem like they're this lone wolf, but when you really dig into who they were going to dinner with and hanging out with and going on vacation with, you realize how interconnected so many of these people in these cults are too.
Yeah, and I think I can actually just segue real quick, because you make a perfect point that I can go off of. David Berkowitz, so he wrote a lot of letters when he was in prison to an advisor he had named Lee Chase, who was a Christian woman who was trying to, I guess you would say, witness to him. I don't know if I have the right word for that, but he explains kind of just the insane realities of these cults and how they are able to work in broad daylight. And so I'm just going to go ahead and quote him liberally here. He says in a letter, obviously this investigation is serious, talking about the investigation of the Son of Sam murders. The article is pretty clear. You know damn well that these Satanists cover their tracks pretty good. You're aware of their intelligence, businessmen, doctors, military personnel, professors, etc. Cults, as you know, flourish around college campuses. They flourish around military bases too. Drugs flow all over these two places, universities and bases. Young servicemen and young college students are involved in sexual relations. So mix the two of them up, put them near each other, and what do you have? You've got a pretty wild, dedicated, and nasty bunch of young zealots, anti-establishment devil worshippers. And what a deadly mixture it is. So what he's saying there is you have these kind of high up people, doctors, businessmen, military personnel, who are connected. And I mean, an example of that, Michael Aquino, high up military personnel, working at a military base. You're able to apply these young, impressionable people with drugs and sex, and you're able to get them mixed up in things like Satanism. And when they're applied with drugs and sex, and you can get them to do something reprehensible, then you've got them, and then they belong to you. I want to quote one more letter from David Berkowitz before I kind of talk about the broader story. This is just him talking about the problem of satanic cults, and keep in mind he was involved in one. I could tell you honestly that a great many people are suffering because of their evil indulgences. There are certain powerful persons who are able to gain entrance into other people's minds and souls. You asked about Satanists. I'm not talking of thrill seekers who hang on to and join every anti-establishment group which comes along. I'm not talking about those who remain on the fringe of such groups. My letter is in reference to the elite and dedicated hardcore members of occult groups. You see, these people cannot be taken lightly. Please try to understand their philosophy of life and society. They have no fear of man-made laws nor the laws of God. To them, murder comes easy. Being anti-God, they love nothing better than a good kill. These people will stop at nothing in order to fulfill their desires. They have the complete ability to elude the police and to cover their tracks completely. Many members of these hidden and secret groups are participating of their own free wills. Others aren't. Yet, they are there to obey every command and complete every task without question. Lost souls, half-mad zombies they are. Mr. Gilroy, there is a very important key that cannot be overlooked. It all ends in tragedy. So many people who have followed the left-hand path have met either sudden death via accident, suicide, or murder, or they have suffered financial loss, the ruination of their reputations, or they just ended up totally insane. It is the same sad story. John and Michael are dead. My life is ruined too, and I also came close to death several months ago. Look, there are people out there who are criminals. There are people who are a fearless lot. They hate God. I'm not talking about common criminals. You know who I'm talking about. Yeah, so that's obviously a lot. And I mean, that letter in itself, I think you could just put that on a billboard and it wouldn't have to go much further than that. But we can talk about Son of Sam. I just wanted to preface it by saying this is not just some guy who committed a murder or a series of murders and then just said, I was part of a cult to just have plausible deniability and try and get himself a better sentence. This is someone who's very sincerely caught up in something very serious and is trying to deal with it. He also never published these letters during his trial or anything like that. These were private correspondences that were acquired by a journalist. So, but we can go from there, but I just thought I would start with that.
That's fascinating. It's interesting too, how a paragraph like that is so profound is hidden so well and has so much information that I'm sure almost everybody listening to this, including me, it's their first time ever even being exposed to it. That's
Mhm.
some extremely explosive information in there to come from somebody who was involved with the things that he was, you know,
Yeah.
and that also shatters so many public narratives that people in cults are these emo looking, you know, people that wear all black and they're super identifiable and they're just practicing some little witchcraft in a room. It's like, no, a lot of these people are the people you see every day. They're people that help you at the bank. They're people that you go see when you don't feel good and they're prescribing you medicine. They're people that teach your kids in school. You know, the broad scope of the people involved with this is very, very alarming, but that in itself is really hard, I think, too, for people to wrap their minds around that. And that's really prophetic coming from somebody like this guy, who I know you're going to get into it, but I mean, he's pretty credible with the things that he's done, and that's been found out about him for this to be not true.
Yeah. So, I mean, I started off with a bit of a bombshell for sure. But as you get into the story more and more, uh, it confirms, it only goes further to confirm the notion that he was involved in satanic cults and he was telling the truth as opposed to discrediting it. So I can touch real quick on the common understanding of the Son of Sam case. So I believe it was 1974 in New York. People started getting shot. And there was a common motive, or I should say a common detail, which is that they were all shot by a specific gun, which was a 44 caliber Bulldog revolver, which is a very specific gun. And so once ballistics were able to determine, okay, this is all the same gun, and it seems that it also happens to be young couples who are parked in their cars, they realize we have a killer on our hands, a serial killer. And it caused probably the greatest amount of hysteria that's ever happened in New York. It was already happening during a great period of crime in the city, maybe the most crime the city's ever faced. I don't
Was
know.
this right in New York City, or was it
New York
somewhere?
City.
Yeah.
Um, Primarily in Queens, but
Wow.
New York City as a whole. And so obviously there's a lot of hysteria. They're trying to figure out who this 44 caliber killer is. But then a letter gets sent to the police. And this person, it was a very cryptic letter. The person refers to himself as the Son of Sam, but also refers to himself as the Behemoth, as one of the members of the 22 disciples of hell, but that was just forgotten because they were not under the impression that multiple people were doing it. It was that one guy's doing it. So the Son of Sam is what they took and they ran with. And so more and more murders kept happening and more letters kept arriving. The police were trying to figure out who this one guy is, but there was an independent journalist he actually worked for IBM at the time as like a writer in their computer journals. His name was Maury Terry. And he was following the case and he said, there's no way. This has to be somebody, this has to be a group of people. And so he started looking into the letters written by the Son of Sam, and he was finding inconsistencies. You know, he was saying, okay, well, this handwriting is different than this one. There's grammatical errors here, but not here. The Son of Sam put riddles, which Maury Terry solved. It led him to Yonkers, New York, and it actually led him to this place called Pine Street, where he started asking questions, and he found a guy named Sam Carr, who was this old man who had two sons named John and Michael Carr, who happened to be students in the same high school class as Maury Terry. And he remembered them and he said, oh, wow, I know these guys. And he started asking questions and finding that John and Michael Carr were involved in Satanism. And they happened to be associated with David Berkowitz, not coincidentally. And as Berkowitz ends up getting caught, they find it's him. And Maury Terry ends up sitting down with him. And he's already developed this kind of theory about like, okay, John and Michael Carr are likely involved. And he starts asking questions and saying like, well, David, what do you know about John and Michael Carr? And he says like, well, I can't answer that. And he says, well, why? Why can't you answer that? He says, because there's a lot of people out there, maybe hundreds, who would be compromised if I shared that information with you, and that they might come for my life. So of course, you're an independent journalist who gets that kind of bombshell from the most I guess you'd say, popular serial murder case in history. He dives in. He finds out that John and Michael Carr were both involved in some form of satanic murder or another, not murder, but satanic theology or another. Michael Carr was involved in Scientology. John Carr was basically just seemed to be some kind of what would you say, like an offshoot of Satanism. He was involved in sacrifice and these sorts of things. Well, Maury Terry gets this information, and as he's involved in this case and he starts talking to David Berkowitz, both John Carr and Michael Carr get murdered. And so now he's like, okay, there's clearly something at play here. His investigation leads him to North Dakota, strange far cry from New York. He finds out that John Carr and Michael Carr are also involved in a satanic cult that operates in Minot, North Dakota, and that people are saying, yeah, this is a real cult that's involved in murder, and it's actually a network all across the country. And so he's got a real case on his hands, but Berkowitz goes silent. He says, let me say why. He's in prison, and he's kind of corresponding a little bit to help people with this case, despite the fact that he was convicted for these murders, and his throat gets slit in prison. Almost dies. And so he goes silent for 16 years. But one of the prison security guards at this prison that David Berkowitz is at befriends him over a number of years, and Berkowitz ends up coming to Christ. And he talks to Maury Terry about 16 years later, and he says to him, I'll take an interview with you. And so he goes on Inside Edition, by the way. This is not like the National Enquirer. This is not Infowars.com. Bill O'Reilly hosts the show, and Maury Terry interviews David Berkowitz. And he goes on TV and he says, I did not act alone. I was a part of a satanic cult. I only pulled the trigger on one of those murders. I was there for all, I think it was 8. I was there for all 8, involving 14 people, but I only pulled the trigger on one. And I was part of a satanic cult. We worshipped Moloch, we worshipped Lucifer, we worshipped Satan, we were involved in witchcraft. He's admitting this all. And it never really went further than that. It never got mainstream traction, I guess you would say. The New York Police Department, because it showed evidence that they were covering up this information that they had, denied it full scale. But it was there for the public. I think I can just go ahead and pull some of the information that Berkowitz disclosed real quick here, because it links so many other parties. So he had this book called The Anatomy of Witchcraft that his cult used. He gave it to Maury Terry, and he wrote on the first page, you wouldn't believe who this book belonged to. There's a lot of reason to believe that it either belonged to Robert the Grimston or Charles Manson. But he doesn't say that himself. There's a lot of research that has to go to it. So David Berkowitz admits that he was a member of a splinter group of the Process, which is what I just touched on earlier in the episode. He admitted that Robert the Grimston was likely there. He doesn't explicitly say it, but he says that leaders of the Process were there when the murders were planned in New York. Let's see, he says, quote, I have good reason for estimating the membership of the cult to run into several thousand men and women. He says that it's all across the country. He also highlighted a reference to a cult in Houston, Texas. It still makes me laugh reading some of this stuff. He highlights a chapter in the book, The Anatomy of Witchcraft, called Evil on the Coast. There he underlined a sentence in a section about the Process. Thou shalt kill. They say they are dedicated to bringing about the end of the world by murder, violence, and chaos. But they, the chosen, will survive to build a new world of satanic glory. So I did touch on that earlier when we talked about the Process and Charles Manson. And I mentioned that it was connected. I didn't realize, because there's a huge book, like 600 pages, just how explicit it was. But David Berkowitz was a member of the Process. And then on the same page with a specifically marked asterisk and brackets, Berkowitz zeroed in on a section about the Chingons, which was a splinter group of the process when they went underground. He said in a letter that he wrote to Lee Chase, California is the home of the Chingon and other foul groups. So common history, you go on Wikipedia, it says David Berkowitz acted alone. He was involved in the murder of 8 people. He pulled the trigger. That was that. He's the only person who ever served a prison sentence for his murders. He's still in prison to this day. And yet, clear as day, he admits that on TV, on national television, that he was involved in other satanic groups. The New York Police Department never picks it up, and that's that. There's actually, there's a lot of really interesting, I guess you would say, details that maybe illustrate just how deep this runs. So one of the ways that Maury Terry caught the trail that a satanic cult was involved in this is that he found a bunch of sacrificed German shepherds in this park in Yonkers, New York, called Untermeyer Park, which we talked about sacrificed German shepherds and how that was a sign of the process. First of all, Untermeyer Park was built by a guy named Samuel Untermeyer, who was an occultist, who was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. That was a group that Aleister Crowley was a part of. That was one of the most prolific satanic groups of the 19th century. And they went to the park for that purpose. There was a room out in the forest of that park, kind of off a beaten path, where it was like basically like a drainage ditch. And inside the drainage ditch, it was sprayed with blood, pentagrams, it said Satan, all these sorts of things. There's pictures of it. Okay, you can find them on the internet if you just look up Untermeyer Park pump room. However, the police fully deny any possibility that David Berkowitz was ever involved in a satanic cult, despite the fact that to this day, he'll go into interviews and say, yeah, we went to Untermeyer Park. Untermeyer was a part of the Golden Dawn, and certain things happen to go down there, like the sacrifice of German shepherds. Common information. This is not, I could pull this on the internet as easily as you could or anybody else. I think there's one more quote here that I really think is important to hit on. Yes, he was talking about the anatomy of witchcraft. He says, if you could have seen this book, then you'd understand. It was full of satanic symbols, prayers, and most of all, pictures. Do you know someone by the name Eliphas Levi? He had this picture drawn up. It was a picture of a goat head attached to the body of a man. It was called Baphomet. I did stare at this picture for hours on end. It's frustrating, I guess, because it's like, I don't know how many signs, how many direct quotes, how many obvious things that you could piece together that I could put together just off Google right now. And yet still, it's honored as a fact in common society that David Berkowitz acted alone. When if you just look at basic facts that were recorded, not by a police officer, but by a member of the public, that this is clearly documented satanic cult activity. Like, I think if you even presented this to a normal person and you just presented them with the information and they would sit down and listen to it, they would say, oh, it's clear as day. He admits it and there's the evidence. Like, what more do you need? I guess you'd have to have a video of him, of somebody else pulling the trigger. Like, I can't wrap my head around it. But he says, Berkowitz says, this cult has thousands of members all across the country. It was evidenced by the fact that there was people involved in North Dakota. He says that they committed murders in California, including the murder of Arliss Perry in 1974, which the man who murdered Arliss Perry, I forget his name, I believe it was Stephen Crawford. This was not a Son of Sam murder. This was a murder that was completely considered a separate event. He was just caught and put in prison. I think it was in 2017. It's the final scene of the documentary on Maury Terry's work, which is on Netflix. But it's so funny because the guy who murdered Arliss Perry, he's like 70 some years old, maybe 80. They go into his house. He commits suicide on the spot, I guess before he was quote unquote caught. But they go in his closet and he has occult books and things in his closet. And the other book he has in his closet is this book right here, which is The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry, which is the documentation of David Berkowitz not acting alone. I struggle to put together a better case for why satanic cults are real than this case right here. And yet Maury Terry is remembered by a lot of people to this day as some kind of like crackpot. If you just search like Son of Sam documentary on, you'll probably get an article. I did see an article when I was first researching this last summer. I don't remember if it was from Vice or BuzzFeed or one of those kind of bullshit publications that said Son of Sam documentary reveals copious errors and proves Maury Terry is a crackpot obsessed with this notion. Obviously they didn't read the book, but it's public information. And ultimately, like, I can give the information to people and it's helpful for them, but what it'll reveal more than anything is just how unwilling people are to look into alternative narratives about history, even if they're true almost beyond a shadow of a doubt. So yeah, it's you want proof of satanic cults, there you go.
And that's interesting too, because you look at a lot of these cases where these narratives come up and they just don't make sense if you actually look into it. There's the couple headlines that you get from the public narrative, but there's a lot of cases in history. You just named a few of them, especially this last one with Berkowitz, but we can go do little Google searches and clearly see that a lot of these stories just don't make sense, even if the evidence isn't 100% obvious of the exact story. Looking at the public narrative versus the evidence, it's like, wait a minute, there's some things that don't match up here, right? And that's always where, for me, it's like, who's behind all of this that they don't want exposed to the public, because there has to be a reason why, courts will take on certain cases and why police will investigate certain things. And then why other things, there's just, a graceful, I'm just going to look this way no matter what. I don't care that there's piles of evidence. I'm told to look this way and I'm going to, so that's always fascinating to me. And that is incredible how much evidence is pointing to a completely different verdict than this case, and that there's been no investigation into any of these allegations from somebody who's been in prison all these years and who has nothing to lose, and even if somebody were to go do an investigation, all of it's bullcrap, why hasn't there at least just been an investigation into these allegations?
Yeah. You've given me a lot there. It's The Ultimate Evil is an excellent book. Everybody should read it. It is a big book, so you may want to break it up into pieces, or there's a documentary on Netflix, which is excellent. It's a little unfair to Maury Terry at the end. They come to I would say, less than optimal conclusion based on reading the book. But if you don't want to read 500 pages or you don't have the time, just watch the documentary. I'll send you a link so you can put it in there for people to watch. But you said there's things that don't make sense. I want to give you one really, really obvious example that when you just can't look at it and then like say the case was decided as it should be truly. One of the murders that David Berkowitz was involved in, one that he admitted, okay, I was there, I didn't pull the trigger though. He was seen about within 30 seconds of the shot that killed one of the victims, picking up a parking ticket off of his car, which was factually proven to be his car. And the ticket was timed, because that's what happens, what a cop does when they write a ticket. They create for lack of a better term, a cache of evidence which can be used. And a witness saw David Berkowitz. This was after he'd been caught. They knew what his face looked like. They had a sketch, picking up a ticket off of his car. Now, about 200 meters away, 30 seconds later, a shot gets fired and somebody dies. Somebody saw the shot and produced a police description. It doesn't look anything like David Berkowitz. And even then, when somebody saw him 200 meters away, there's no way that he could have traveled that distance in that time and fired that shot from that location. It's not possible. It's not possible. Like, Now, the only way to discount that is to just deny it ever happened, and that is what the New York Police Department did. The only police example of them actually looking at this evidence wholesale was done by the district attorney of Queens. His name was John Santucci. He saw that, and when he saw that, he realized, okay, it couldn't just be Berkowitz, and he reopened the case. Now, if you ask, I guess you would say former members of the NYPD to this day about John Santucci and about this case, like I believe Detective Borelli is a man who gets quoted a lot in the documentary, the Son of Sam documentary, and says Maury Terry's lying and all this. He'll say, I don't know what John Santucci's saying. He just must be looking for fame. That's kind of more or less what the whole investigation is dispelled as, is a quest for fame. However, it's just not possible if you look at the evidence that he could have acted alone. And that's kind of the story of a lot of these really extreme cases, is that when it reveals a cover-up, when it reveals negligence, the people who are supposed to be getting justice just deny it. They just say, well, it makes me look bad, we have to suppress it. And so because of that, we have a public that doesn't know today that there is a, dare I say, flawless case study of satanic cults committing mass murder and a trail of evidence to prove it, but they don't know that it's right under their noses because the police that investigated it won't admit it.
Now, did he ever give names of who else was involved, or was it more just the details, but he wasn't willing to say that in public?
He wouldn't give names of the people who were involved because they had photos of his family, they had photos of him, and he was more or less spooked into not staying silent, but giving some of the details after having his throat slit in prison. Also, he said that most of the people, or a large percentage of the people that were involved in his specific cult, keep in mind it's a network, but the people who were involved in his specific cult were murdered themselves to hide the evidence. That would include John Carr and Michael Carr, among others. But yeah, he that was the one thing he wouldn't give in any of his interviews, despite saying he was part of the process and he was he met with some of the leaders and these other things. He wouldn't give names.
That's interesting too, because he's still alive. I wonder if he'll ever choose to give names, and if the public will even care if he does.
Yeah, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I'm hoping maybe that I could get there one day. Perhaps I could get in contact with David Berkowitz. I don't know about the logistics of that yet. But I wonder about these cases when they turn 50, 60 years old, if there ever is a chance while these people are still alive to gain truth, or if it's one of these secrets that dies with the person who is involved.
Yeah. And like you said, the network, right? That's also really hard to, for even us to wrap our minds around, just how many people surrounding a criminal are supporting it in some way, whether it's directly participating or helping to cover up, or it's just simply looking the other way. Like these police officers are probably ordered to, with not even investigating, and with the trail of people who die and who are killed off that go looking into these cases, these journalists that might write about it, family members that might speak up, the paper trail of deaths too, associated with outliers who are trying to get the truth out. That's enough to scare anybody into silence, or at least to only give certain details or to paint just so much of the picture versus giving the whole thing.
Yeah, and I mean, let's go back again to what Berkowitz said. It's powerful people, businessmen, doctors, military members. Who's going to be the best connected? It's not going to be bums on the street. It's going to be the people who are involved with other powerful people who maybe they're the people they talk to are involved too. Maybe they're not. Maybe they owe them a favor. But the details are there to help cover up. It's not, these aren't stories that are, like they're just waiting to be seen by the public. They are both done in mind, knowing that they will be easier covered up, and they benefit because of that. And I mean, ultimately, it's one of the biggest reasons why people aren't willing to look at them in the face, because powerful people are saying, no, it's not true. And that's all it takes for most people.
Yeah, and we're conditioned to look at powerful people and respect them. We look at them as successful, and there's really no shadow of a doubt in most people's minds that people like that could be capable of doing something so horrific. And that's the whole public perception of criminals look like crackheads and they're just one and done weirdos on the streets, and that is the case sometimes, but it's, I would say, the majority of the time with really big things that happen all over the world, those aren't orchestrated by just stupid crackheads on the street. These are very intelligent people who have a lot of protection, a lot of power, a lot of money.
Yeah.
That sets up the perfect environment for crime, criminal action, and cover-up operations.
Right. Yeah. No. And that's the point, is that crimes that heinous couldn't be covered up by a person on the street. They could only be covered up by someone who had the means to do so. And you brought up obliquely the Jeffrey Epstein thing earlier, and I was listening to something about it earlier this week, and the person who was talking about it brought up something that I didn't even know, which is crazy, because as crazy of an event as it is. But this former Speaker of the House, that in 2007, his name was Denny Hastert, was a serial child molester and was convicted of child molestation, on a mass amount. The person who's second in line to the presidency after the vice president. We've had speakers of the House who have become president, Gerald Ford, and yet he was a serial child molester, and this was going under the radar. And I mean, I didn't even know that. Okay, like that. We're not talking about 50 years ago. This is 15 years ago. Like, I remember George Bush being president. Okay, and a year before the election that Barack Obama became president, you have a Speaker of the House going down for serial child molestation. By the way, he only got 13 months in prison for that, which is just, and he received a fine, which can be paid by anybody. But so yeah, these types of things can be covered up only by powerful people, and that is why powerful people do them, because they can be covered up. Because the truth of the matter is, if you're a bad person and you'll get away with something, then you're more likely to do it.
100%. I think that's been one of the most shocking things that I've learned throughout this whole journey, because that was my perception too, just from everything that I've seen. A lot of the stories that either make it mainstream or documentaries, or even how some of these people are painted. Charles Manson, for example, you don't read in common literature how connected he was to powerful people. You really have this vision of him that he's this piece of trash person, which I believe he was, but the caliber of who he was hanging out with weren't, in the public's eyes, trash people. He was hanging out with literally presidential, people sitting in office, and presidential candidates, and people hanging out with presidential candidates and future presidents, and everything in between. So that's also fascinating too, just how they'll take a criminal and even almost distort their own identity to the public versus disclosing the people that they're spending time with on weekends and who they're getting dinner with, so the public also looks at people who are convicted, and they're almost looking at them like these just, one-off trash people on the streets that happen to do all these horrible things, and they're caught and they go to jail, and that's it. And it's like, man, if you only knew, all the pieces that connect these people into a network. And that's really the most important word is network, which you've mentioned a bunch of times today.
Yeah. Well, for sure. I mean, Charles Manson's a really good flagrant example. And like I mentioned, he, was involved with the Beach Boys and other celebrities. He actually wrote a song for the Beach Boys, which they have on one of their albums. If you give me about 10 seconds here, I can actually find what it's called. They changed the name.
Absolutely.
But it is a song that they've published.
And he actually wrote the lyrics to it?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
It's called Never Learned Not to Love. And he talked about it. Charles Manson would talk about how they took this song from him. You can look it up. But he wrote that song, and the Beach Boys used it. There was a lot of people in the music scene. You'll learn that David McGowan talks about it at Laurel Canyon. But there's a lot of people in the music scene who really respected Charles Manson as an artist. Like, they didn't know him. They're like, okay, he's kind of this weird guy, a little unstable. But at the same time, a little bit par for the course for the time that he was in, especially in Hollywood, where morals were already questionable to begin with. I can't think of the exact name. I want to, I don't know. I'll look it up and we can talk about it later. But there was there was an artist of the hippie movement who was very well respected, who said that Charles Manson was actually a musical genius. And there was Dennis Wilson used to say on tour with the Beach Boys, like, yeah, we're actually thinking about producing an album for him. This is all before the murders, but he had some reputation. And like I mentioned, a lot of those hippie movement artists all had to distance themselves later. But he hung out with all of them. He was attending their parties. They were friends. They gave him money. I personally don't think those are just things that you write off. Maybe I'm in the minority in that belief, right? But these high level things, these heinous things, they happen because they have the backing of people in power, not in spite of it, because they have the backing.
And that's such an important point to bring up, because that's historically, if you look at cover-ups, that's exactly why, because there's power and money involved, and people sitting in positions of power. Now, what would you say, having done so much research and being able to even connect some or all of these cults that we've talked about today, what would you say are some common characteristics in general of a cult?
All right. Okay. That's a broad question, but I'm going to give me about 3 seconds here to think about this. I think from what I've observed, the really, really pervasive cults, whether it be Temple of Set, Jonestown, there are some exceptions, but when you're looking at more historically notable ones, you're always going to find an intelligence connection. Jim Jones was involved in military intelligence. Like he's involved with a guy named Dan Mitrione, who was involved in both military intelligence and torture during the Vietnam War. He had contact with, I believe, an ambassador to Guyana. I mean, he had an extreme budget of money and he had a car to drive around the entire time he was in Jonestown. There's a lot of reason to believe that like they were being funded by the CIA. But I don't want to get too specific here. Cults in general have two categories when you're dealing with really, really heinous ones. They're either connected or they're not. And if they're not connected, then they're just some religious zealot who's psychotic, who operates in the woods out of nowhere. But if they're not, then they're involving high-level people, probably intelligence, and there's a lot of money being passed around. That, other than that, there's not a lot of commonalities. Satanic cults tend to be the most prevalent, at least that we've seen up until now, meaning that like there's not as much documentation when you're talking about like modern cults like Nexium and things like that. So I'm going off of like a bit of a dated historical phenomenon. Satanism is like pretty much the only theological unifying thing. It's Satanism and the belief of like that the person you're dealing with is God. Forgive me for not giving you a good answer. You caught me off guard there, but
no, it's okay. It is a broad question, but I think that that's kind of fascinating too, just being able to identify little key things. I would even maybe go as far to say that mind control could be a commonality of most of them,
It has to be, right? I mean,
otherwise why would people stay if they, people don't consciously participate in things. It's a very unconscious loyalty that people have to these cults that's cultivated through mind control, so I think that that's a big part of the foundation of these too.
Yeah. I one other thing that comes in passing is apocalypse theology. That I would say that one's actually very, very prevalent. Obviously, like I said, the process and Charles Manson believed in the coming end of the world. Heaven's Gate, which is kind of an unconnected and cult of crazies who all committed suicide in San Diego in a house in the 90s because they believed the world was ending, and if they committed suicide, they'd be transported to a spaceship in the sky. That also is cause for people doing crazy things, because they're kind of presented with this ultimatum like, well, I'm either in or I'm out, but the world is ending and I better get on the bus soon. And I'm kind of getting warmed up again to this question that you're asking, but there's certain dynamics that cults have that make them pervasive and allow them to exist in plain sight. This is not a tenet as much as it is a mechanic, but their doctrine is very, very toothless and typically just strange on the outside, maybe even a little bit beneficial. So like with Nexium, it was kind of like this self-help group for women, which you bring them in and you don't really tell them what's going on. You just kind of help them. And some of them you won't really trust, so you'll just kind of keep them on the outside. But there's a few that you think you can trust, and you bring them in a little further. And then there might be one there, and you bring them in a little further. So it's kind of like the idea of you don't put the frog in the pot and turn the water to boiling. You just do it ever so slowly, and before you know it, he's cooked. That's quite literally like what secret societies do when you have like the Freemasons who have 33 degrees of initiation, for a lack of a better term, where they don't reveal the secrets until you get to the end. Scientology did the same thing. There is this document that it's kind of controversial in the community when you're talking about Scientology, but there's this document that L. Ron Hubbard published that basically when you get to the end of Scientology, you're told like, well, evil, the truth is you need to be evil. Basically, the truth is that everything is a lie and all is permitted. And that's a lot of the secrets that you'll get revealed that are revealed in a lot of secret societies all across history, like the Assassins, which were a secret society in the Middle East in like 800 or 900 AD. But the point is that they look harmless on the outside. They draw in unknowing people, and you bring them in slowly and slowly and slowly until they don't even realize that they're so far in over their head, there's nothing they can do. And typically that might take the form of them being involved in a sacrifice of sorts. Maybe it's just a dog, but maybe it's something more than that. And then they realize, well, now they've got me. And so what do I do? And so when Berkowitz says something like, there's many people who have no choice but to be in this cult, that's what he's talking about. I mean, he gave photos away of his family. And he said, that's why when people asked him, can you give away names? He said, no, I'm bound by blood. I'm bound by an oath. Don Meaderick in Hand of Death says to Henry Lee Lucas, there's only one way out of this cult, right? And so that's the point, is that they're designed to bring you in slowly. If truly, like I kind of went a lot of directions when you first asked me that question, but the single unifying factor about any cult is that you don't really know what you're in for until you're in too deep. And that's why you have to get the information out to these people that you can't mess with these things. Just because there's a bunch of fun, profound looking hippies walking around Haight-Ashbury with pamphlets and talking about world peace, that might sound good on the surface, but if you don't have information to never ever go talk to those people, you might look up one day and you're drinking a German Shepherd's blood and there's nothing more you can do.
Not to mention, like you said, the blackmail. Look at somebody like Berkowitz who stayed silent because there's people that have that blackmail on him that he doesn't want released. That's also a big part of, I would say, maybe not just cults, but secret societies and just evil in general, and the cover up behind it. There's a lot of things that people are committing behind the scenes that either maybe they're drugged while they're doing, or they willingly participate, not knowing that there's a camera, not knowing that there's photographs, not knowing that there's some type of physical evidence that a crime was committed, or robberies. And I'm not just meaning like blatant going into a bank, but almost laundering, doing things that have a paper trail that can be proven too. There's a lot of different ways to keep somebody captive instead of forcing somebody in. There's always free will that people say, well, why don't these people just leave? If they're sitting at some weird property where there's all these evil people, why don't they just leave? And it's like, what if there was a threat that your whole family was going to die if you leave, or that whatever the type of blackmail is, there's a lot of things that hold us captive mentally and emotionally versus just having a physical attachment. It's not always so easy as people think to maybe leave some of these things.
Yeah. And I mean, it takes different forms in different ways. For the Jonestown cult, those people gave away all their possessions to Jim Jones when they moved to Guyana. And so they had no way of getting home, or if they did, they would get home and everybody would already think they were crazy because they had to shun all their friends and family to leave, and they gave away all their possessions. Many people had to give away their children to the cult, and so in that case, you're already dealing with a group of people who are in so deep that they both do not want to, and it would almost not make sense to leave unless they knew what was happening in the future. With satanic cults, you deal more in the kind of lethal blackmail situation. So, like you said, they would be killed, their family would be killed, et cetera, et cetera. These are mechanics that are like almost the most important part that allow these organizations to operate, is that they're not, I said this in the last episode with Freemasonry, but they take an oath, a blood oath, to protect these secrets. And that's how these things are able to be secret. Like, common people, and I don't mean common people in any sort of derogatory manner, I just mean people that have yet to learn about these things. They don't realize that what a secret is not just something that your friend whispers in your ear and something that's on you as a good person to keep. It's that there are ways to make sure that something goes to the grave if you really, really want information to be protected. And that if a group does that on a mass scale, there's not much you can do. I mean, it's how the mafia was able to operate, for 30 years in plain sight. And you have J. Edgar Hoover saying, well, there's no proof that they exist. Yeah, as the head of the FBI, or, Ken Lanning, who's with the FBI, says there's no proof of satanic cults existing. And I'm not just saying that there isn't. Maybe that's a more sinister cover-up. It's not just incompetence. But point being is that there are inherent mechanics that these groups operate within that allow what they do to be secret. And if you don't learn about them, you will never just find out incidentally. And that gives them the freedom to do these things, which is why it's important you have to cast a light on how it works.
Yes. And even with, Freemasonry and occults even, there's also the generational aspect of that's normalized when your grandpa did it and your father did it and your brother did it and now you're doing it. There's so many ways to catfish somebody into thinking something might be good or for their benefit. And like you said, by the time they know it, they're in too deep anyways. And the whole facade of what they thought they were doing is completely inverted on the inside.
Yeah. And I mean, the doctrine of cults, or whatever term you want to use, helps it too, because when you start telling people in the satanic theology way of saying like, well, no, we have the secret knowledge and this allows you to be God, or this allows you to have whatever you want, that you combine that with like, and by the way, we'll kill your family if you leave. What more do you need, I guess? I don't mean that in a funny way, but like those two things combined together is a pretty airtight way to keep whatever you're doing secret and to have it done well.
100%. And gosh, for people who are listening, I want to do like a whole episode just like on Freemasonry with you, because you've done such extensive research on that. And for people who aren't following Matty on Twitter, if you're on Twitter, he curated a couple incredible, absolutely incredible threads on Freemasonry. And he has one also on cults, where he's covered some of the information that we've covered in the last 2 episodes too. But gosh, the research that you have done, Matty, is just, it's incredible. You blow my mind. I thought you were so much older than what you are, because it seems like you've been doing this for, I mean, a whole career. It seems like the research that you've done is what somebody would do in 40, 50 years. And I'm absolutely amazed by you. And I've learned so much from you just these past 2 episodes, and I'm excited to do more podcasts with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited too, and I want to just say thank you. You really you give me no shortage of praise, and I certainly appreciate it so much. I stand on the shoulders of giants. Ultimately, it's guys like Maury Terry, Bill Cooper, some of the other guys that I've mentioned who ultimately, you know, they're risking their lives putting out these works. It's a lot easier for me to read them, you know, at my house and compile the information and look for more rather than being on the front lines. I don't say that to belittle myself. I just say that I have so much gratitude for the people who are doing these things. And I do, it's one of my greatest hopes that I can bring them honor, you know, from the other side to continue their legacy. So, and I really, I'm excited to keep doing that. That ultimately, that's, I think, besides truly exposing these evil things, I think I take great honor in honoring the legacy of people who started this and, you know, were told they were crazy for their entire lives and they just kept pushing on.
And the research that you've even done to uncover their work, you know, it's not easy finding the material that you found and digging for these books and digging for this literature, and even online trying to dig up documents that are maybe historic or aren't really in print anymore and are always scrubbed off the internet. And I think it's also so special, you know, a lot of the people that are in this movement are women, you know, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think it's so incredible, not just your age, but the fact that you're a gentleman doing this, and you're a young man doing this, and that's just so unheard of. You know, you don't meet many 23-year-olds that have this as some type of an interest, you know, and for you, it spans so much more than just learning about it. Understanding this stuff for the public can be, I mean, that could ultimately change the world in exposing all of this all the way back through time, and understanding the crimes that have been covertly being committed or covered up throughout history that we've learned a completely different narrative of. You know, like, you're basically uncovering the real history, as uncomfortable as it is to listen to. You know, this is the truth that was veiled by the mainstream, and that was changed over time, you know, and these are things that bring awareness to people, whether it's in their home, in their community, just learning what's out there. I think too, just helps create that awareness of people just understanding that these are the people that are catering to us at the bank and at all, you know, at the doctor's office. And to have that awareness can be crucial, especially if you're taking children to, you know, these people that are all over, just sprinkled all over communities and states and countries. And it helps debunk some of these mysteries, I think, too, people have in their mind of just not being able to understand how this works. Just seeing a story like Charles Manson and thinking that was just one person committing something, and, you know, there wasn't any more to it, that what we got from the mainstream is the whole story. And being able to network these connections and figure out how these major, you know, 600 murders, how all this was able to be orchestrated, that it really took a community to do this. You know, that's, I think for people, that's important for them to be able to wrap their mind around this being true, is being able to simply have the awareness that these networks exist. And once you realize that, it's like you said, you can go on Google pretty easily, and it might take a little bit of time, but you can really piece together a lot with current events too, in making connections and figuring out the bigger picture of what we're not being told. And I just really honor you for that. I think you're incredible. I think the work that you've done, even just Twitter's not really the best platform to put really long threads, you know, and even your work on that was so eloquent, and all the work that you put into just creating this massive thread that people could spend hours looking into, and even more hours taking the resources, the books that you mentioned, the videos that you posted. and doing their own independent research and digging further. You're helping open up doors for people even like me who are interested in this, saying, where do I even start? This information is not easily accessible online. What do I do? And you're very simply not only describing it and putting out the information and making it palatable, but all the resources that you provide, all of the sources that you name, all the direct quotes, like just putting this podcast together. I hope people understand, like, this is a lot of work that you did just for this episode. This is a lot of research that you did on actual people. It's not just your own philosophies. This is a lot of research from work that's not common or easily found. And I just think you're amazing. I'm so excited to watch you blossom, and the fact that you're doing this so young. I think if I was 23 and learned all of this, I'm 36 now. It's like, I can't even imagine what I would have accomplished in 13 years since being 23, and I'm just so excited to see where this path leads you, because I think you're going to be a real shining star, and people are going to really need this information, especially with the lack of people, not just your age, but in general, covering these topics. So I'm really excited, Matty, and I really appreciate you so much.
I can't thank you enough. It's, as you know, it's a weird process. You spend a lot of time going down what feels like a lot of weird paths, and you don't really know whether it'll pay off or if at all. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I just read stuff and was just like, well, I hope it comes in handy. It feels like it might. And, I can't tell you how many dollars I've spent buying books, and not to make it about that, but the point is it is a needle in a haystack kind of process, and to have some effect, to feel like it is reaching somebody, is really satisfying, because I didn't start this process expecting that I ever would. I just did it because I found it interesting, and ultimately it led me somewhere meaningful. So I'm very thankful for all that has turned out. I'm very thankful to have met someone who sees the value in it.
Absolutely. It's just so fun. And like I said, I would have never guessed that this is your first time ever doing podcasts. You're so well spoken about it too, which is, you break it down really easily, and you're very well spoken. And these are just, I think they're fantastic episodes, and I'm so excited to launch them. Now, where can people find you? Can you remind people of your Twitter handle and where you're at online, how they can get in touch with you if maybe they missed that on the first episode, or if they're just tuning in for the first time?
Yeah, so I'm only posting on Twitter at the moment, but my Twitter handle is Big Sur Lifeguard, BigSurLifeguard. And if you need anything, if you have a question, can't find a book that I mentioned, feel free to shoot me a DM. A lot of these books I have links to PDF wise, because I get it. You can't spend thousands of dollars buying books. I don't myself, because, money's not something that, I can just throw away either. But you got a question, shoot it to me. I'll do my best to answer it. Feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much for being here, Matty. And for people listening, please connect with Matty. He's super easy to get a hold of. He literally answered me right away whenever I reached out to him the first time. And he has all of his threads on his Twitter page really easily accessible too. And you can always DM me too if you guys can't find him. But I'm going to have all of his information in the show notes. I'll have his Twitter handle there. I'll have the resources that he sends me and some of the links to the sources that he mentioned today. And for you guys listening, share this with people. This is really educational, and it's palatable. A lot of these things that we just especially talked about today, a lot of people have probably heard of. This isn't some, crazy conspiracy that's really new to people. These cases are public, and a lot of people have heard of one or more of these names today. And what Matty's offering is just an alternative view to look at them and to piece some of these puzzles together and these connections that maybe we didn't get with the mainstream version that was very watered down, that we're all really used to being exposed to over these generations. So share this episode. It's a lot easier sometimes than trying to tell this information to somebody after learning it. All you have to do is just send it, and you're supporting the podcast. You're supporting Matty. You're helping him grow. So much potential with him that he is going to be exploring in these years to come, and he's just getting started. And it helps our podcast too whenever you guys are supporting us and sharing this. So subscribe, comment, let us know too in the comments what you liked and any questions that you have directly, and I can go ahead and get those answers for you from Matty if that's easier. Connect with us in the show notes. I have all of our links below on the very last, very bottom of the page has all of our podcast links too. We are also on BitChute. I do worry about YouTube. I've been using that as my main platform, but as some of you know, this is my second time on YouTube. And recently I did just have another video that was deleted from this new account. So please support us on different platforms too, because it helps us grow. So you guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Matty, for being here. God bless you. And we will see you guys next week with part 3.